Well, today the topic is Resurrection Realizations. And what did it take to bring the minds of the disciples around to believing that Jesus would actually rise from the dead and would remain alive? That concept was both Jesus' mission and the disciples' dilemma. And without the resurrection of Christ, we don't have Christianity. All we have is a nice little set of ethics. And without the resurrection, there's no getting born again. There's no hope of eternal life. There's no signs. There's no miracles. There's no wonders. The resurrection of Christ is the cornerstone of Christianity. It's the basis of all true and effective spirituality. And belief in the resurrection of the Christ is the root of our dominion. And the Old Testament prophesied about the death and resurrection victory of the Messiah since way back when, even Genesis. And thousands of years before he was born. And Jesus Christ studied these records. He knew what was going to happen. And early in his ministry, after he'd just chosen his disciples, he'd just come back from his temptation, and he did his first miracle in Cana where he turned the water into wine. He talked about, that was the first time he mentioned that he was going to be killed and raised. That was like right at the very beginning. And then about mid-ministry, mid-year, Jesus became more open and graphic. He didn't talk about this temple's going to be torn down and raised back up. He just flat out said what was going to happen. I'm going to get tortured, I'm going to get killed, and I'm going to get raised from the dead after 3 days. And one of those times, Peter, one of his most trusted disciples, actually grabbed him, pulled him aside out of the crowd, and reproved him for saying that. And then Jesus turned to him and said, "Get behind me, Satan." And Peter might have gone, "What? That's not what I meant." And see, the resurrection was and still is and always has been serious business. Moses couldn't enter the promised land because he didn't teach the resurrection at the exact time God wanted him to. And so God didn't allow him to go into the promised land. He had to wait on the east side of the Jordan and watch everybody go in. It's so big of a deal. It's life-changing. The belief in the resurrection of Jesus was and still is the key to Christianity, because you have to believe that he was raised from the dead. It's not too hard to become a Christian, but it's impossible to stop being. It's worse than being in the mafia. You can't ever leave. Once you're a Christian, you can say you're something else, but you have that spirit within. It's because of the resurrection, we have the greatest gift that's ever been given, that gift of Holy Spirit. Just amazing. So today we're gonna focus on the resurrection realizations, which there are many. And we're going to see a mental process it took for people to believe. Even people who saw him after he rose from the dead still didn't believe he rose from the dead. Doesn't make any sense, but neither do people. The disciples' dilemma. Even after Jesus had told them repeatedly that he would rise up from the dead, his closest followers still found it hard to believe. That would be a hard concept. And they had been with him when he raised 3 people from the dead. And that's all I could find that he had raised from the dead was 3 people during about a year he was doing that earthly ministry. First up was this widow's son who had died, her only son. And this kid had died, and they were in the process of carrying him to a funeral. It was a funeral procession. And Jesus stopped it. And then he told the people, "Stop crying." And they're like, "What?" And then he told the body, "Rise up." And the kid sat up. And it just blew their minds. And then the next up was the deceased daughter of a Galilean synagogue leader. Synagogue could be 10 people, could be 100 people. So usually a rented room or a home or something like that where they would hold these meetings. They were very personal. It wasn't like the big temple. And this leader, they went into his. Jesus just walked right into this man's house when he heard that that he had a deceased daughter, and he said he told the people there, "I'm going to raise her from the dead." And the mourners laughed him to scorn and scolded him. "Shut up, man! Can't you see this is a funeral? We're all weeping here." And then he took her by the hand, by her frail, limp hand, and he told them again to stop crying, and he told the girl, "Get up." And her life returned, and her parents went insane with amazement. And then last up was just a week or two before he himself was killed and raised from the dead. And this healing, and I say healing because that's what it is, this healing, it caused a lot of people to turn onto him. And actually people wanted to see Lazarus as much as they wanted to see Jesus for a period of time. I mean, it was such a big deal around Jerusalem. And this was his good friend Lazarus. He had the sisters Mary and Martha. He stayed at their house many times. And Lazarus had been in the grave for 4 days, and he smelled like death. You might have smelled an animal after 4 or 5 days. Not such a nice odor. And Jesus told the people to remove the stone from the entrance. So a few guys went over there, put their shoulders to it, and rolled the stone away. And then it's open. Then everybody got to enjoy. And Jesus, then he yelled out loud, "Lazarus, come out here." Now imagine what some of the crowd was thinking. Just yelling. This guy had been dead for a long time. And they didn't embalm bodies. They just wrapped him in these grave clothes, and then they put this ointment on there. Usually maybe about 73 pounds of ointment on. And it was real aromatic. And so it helped cover that stench. And Lazarus sat up, put his legs down, and he started walking out of this thing. And because he was wrapped head to toe in this stuff, and they had a napkin probably tied to his face or stuck there with the ointments. I don't know. And Jesus told the people around, "Unwrap him." And after he stopped being dizzy, he gave Jesus a hug, I guess. But it blew the minds of the Judeans and many people believed that Jesus was for real, the Christ at this point. So after those 3 incredible healings, which all the apostles saw, and many of the disciples, they still couldn't wrap their minds around Jesus himself actually rising from the dead. They saw it, they heard it, they read it, they had been taught that their whole life, but it's still just such a crazy concept. What will it take to help them believe? This was Jesus Christ's mission his whole life, because if we don't believe that, then people will never get born again. And these were going to be the people that would be taking it on after he's gone. He knew this. Today we're going to cover the Resurrection Realizations, the ultimate sacrifice. Jesus had been hanging there for about 6 hours, like we talked about last week. He finished his victory song with a loud voice, and then his body just fell limp. That was it. And Christ died about the same hour that the Passover lamb was sacrificed in the temple. And at that very moment, an earthquake rocked Jerusalem. And and amazed by the day's events, and amazed by the attitude and fortitude of this man dubbed the King of the Jews, the centurion who was watching his lackey guys, he gave Jesus a salutation that was fit for an emperor, because they believed the emperor was a god, or they were told he was, and they believed that they were a spiritual being, and so he gave that same kind of a salutation to Jesus right there. And then most of the crowd departed because the show was over now. And it's still Wednesday, about 3 p.m. It's not Friday. Now, every researcher knows this. But because they've talked about Good Friday and all that and Easter Sunday, it's hard to get that out of our heads. But most everybody knows that stuff. And a man named Joseph, and he was from a city called Arimathea, which is about 15 miles west-northwest of Jerusalem. He was a closet disciple of Jesus, and he was a leader in the Sanhedrin, this guy. Well, he walked a quarter mile back, because that's about how far this Golgotha was from where the Roman headquarters were. It's about a quarter mile, not too far. So he walks about 500 steps back to ask Pilate if he could take down and bury the body of Jesus before Passover. And Pilate knew him because he was a Judean leader, but he didn't believe him. He goes, I don't really believe this guy's dead. I'm not going to give you authority to take him down. He goes, let me get that centurion here. So the centurion came that quarter mile, said, yep, he's dead already. And so then the centurion goes back to Golgotha, and he commands his men to break the legs of the live guys because he wanted them all to die fast. So they're hanging there, and now they take these big hammers and they just bust either the femur or the tibia, and then now they can't hold themselves up, and they bleed out more. The centurion wanted him to die. Remember, a condemned person was not considered human to the Romans. It was like killing a sparrow or a worm or an ant. It just didn't mean anything. And so then you think about the cries of agony that pierced the already dark and somber sky. Of course, they didn't break Jesus' legs because he was already gone. But one of the fools took his lance and he still shoved it into his chest and pierced his stomach and heart just to be sure. And at the centurion's command, they picked up the post that Jesus was nailed to, out of its well-used hole. And they had these holes all over the place because they loved to crucify. So they dropped these posts in there and stuff rocks in just to hold it long enough for the person to die. Then they would take that back, put it in the log pile, near the praetorium, and take the nails and put those in a bucket and reuse them. And the Romans were efficient. And then this guy, so they knocked the nails loose from Jesus' hands and feet, took a little hammer, wiggled them loose, pulled them out, threw them in the bucket, and then Joseph and his servants moved Jesus' body to an unoccupied tomb that he owned. Usually a family would have multiple bodies in a tomb, but this was brand new. Nobody had ever been in there before. And in that Joseph was one of the few people who actually believed Jesus would rise from the dead, he opted not to go through the trouble and the time to give him a traditional burial with all the wrappings and the spices and washing him down a certain way. And but he just wrapped Jesus in an expensive linen sheet, just real simply. Just laid a sheet on him, wrapped him in it like you'd put a blanket over you or something, and put him in a tomb and had his servants roll that heavy stone back over the entrance. Then he went back to do Passover. Well, some women were leaning up against another sepulcher, checking their text messages or whatever they were doing, looking down at their iPhones and keeping an eye on what was going on. Because if they didn't see where Joseph took him, they may never know where he is, or take a while, because they didn't mark the graves at that time. And so then there would have been many in that area. So they watched, and so did another member of his fellow member of the Sanhedrin, a guy named Nicodemus. He also saw how this guy how Joseph buried him, and they're like, what is he doing? So now Nicodemus, he goes off, and he goes off to get the right burial accoutrements, the right spices and the wrappings. And the girls, they were going to have to do the same thing. They had to round up the money and get this stuff. And now it's almost a Sabbath. At the Sabbath, they're not going to be able to do anything from evening till the next evening. It'll be Friday during the day before those girls could ever do anything. It's still late Wednesday afternoon. It isn't sundown yet. And so these girls they probably go to eat the Passover and to mourn with the other disciples. How crazy would that be to have seen what they saw over those days? And so this second member of this ruling body of Israel, who'd watch what was happening, he hustled out to buy the proper spices. This guy was rich, so he probably has a little more access than these girls do. So he buys these things, and he buys his burial cloth, and he goes back to Joseph's tomb. So you can turn now to John 19. There's a lot more to this story. This is a rough sketch that we're going to do in this hour. So John chapter 19, verse 39. And there came also Nicodemus, which at the first came to Jesus by night. That's John 7:50. He's another closet disciple. And brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight. Now 100 pounds is the Roman 100 pounds, which is about 73 U.S. pounds. 100 Roman pounds is about 73 U.S. pounds. Now, myrrh and aloes were and still are very, very, very expensive. And remember how the wise men brought myrrh when they came to see Jesus as a toddler? It's that expensive. It would have been an incredible gift. And he was honored with these special spices, pricey spices, at both the beginning and the end of his life. It's interesting. And I was also thinking, we're going to find out he got wrapped up at the beginning of his life, swaddled, and at the end. So it sort of happened twice. It's sort of a swaddling even at the end there, which is what this guy's going to do. But aloes, it's not aloe vera. And this type of aloes is taken from the heartwood of an aquilaria tree, which produces an aromatic resin in its heartwood. And a friend of mine who studied forestry, she told me that it's sort of like cedar. You ever had cedar put in a closet? And 10 years later, you can still smell it. This is cedar on steroids. It's very, very aromatic. And it'll last for years and years. And they're expensive. During that day, people said that this myrrh and aloes was worth its weight in gold. So what Nicodemus bought was freaky expensive. Freakishly expensive. I mean, today I checked, gold is at $12.05 an ounce. $1,205 an ounce, sorry. $1,205 an ounce. And so whatever the cost, whatever the percentage that was in there, it was very expensive, this stuff. And he lavished this on the body of Jesus, this very, very expensive ointment, which was quite a loving gesture. So he would have washed the body a certain ceremonial way, would have wrapped him in this. I don't know if they put the spices on the body, probably over the covering of this. It would have gotten a little bit harder, the grave clothes. And verse 40, John 19, and they took the body of Jesus, this is Nick and his helpers, and wound it in linen clothes with the spices, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. Just like a couple of weeks before with Lazarus. It's the same thing. Then they would have put a napkin, they would have tied that to his face the same. They would have done it just the same way. There was a way to do it. We put people in a casket in their best suit, right? And then people put little trinkets in there sometimes. People write notes and throw it in there. They had a certain way they do stuff. Then you put flowers on the top and it goes down and everybody cries, But it's, they had a certain way they did it. And so it's about 70, when he was wrapped, it was maybe 73, 75 pounds of these grave wrappings. Then they laid him back in, and sort of like a mummy, but he wasn't mummified, like they did in Egypt. It isn't a mummy, but just for a mind picture. And so they put him back in. Verse 41, now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre wherein was never a man yet laid. And they laid Jesus therefore because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand. It was close by. And only the rich were buried in a tomb. Everybody else is buried in these simple graves, typically. And they're unmarked. And a garden could have been like an orchard. So it probably was a nice looking place. It wasn't like a dusty, ugly thing like you usually see on the movies. Probably was fairly decent, especially if it was from a rich guy. He'd want it in a nice hill under that particular tree. And so now remember those two Marys we talked about a second ago. Now they didn't see what Nicodemus had just done. So now how many times had Jesus been buried? Twice. And so they were planning on coming back to properly prepare Jesus' body, but they didn't get around to buying this stuff until Friday, more than likely, because that's when they went back carrying it. We'll get to that in a minute. Now it's Thursday, which is a religious holiday during that year, and it's the Passover. So Matthew 27:62. And it says, now the next day that followed the day of the preparation, preparing for the Passover, the chief priests and the Pharisees came together unto Pilate. So now on Passover, these chief priests who had just caused all this havoc, they go to talk to Pilate, the Roman governor of that area. And they said, sir, we remember that the deceiver, the impostor, said, while he was yet alive, after 3 days I will rise again. Command therefore that the sepulchre be made sure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say unto the people, he is risen from the dead, so the last error will be worse than the first. And Pilate said unto them, you have a watch. Go your way. Make it as sure as you can. So they went and made the sepulchre sure, sealing the stone and setting a watch. It's very likely it wasn't their watch, it was Roman guards that went. And they sealed the stone with like wax, so nobody was supposed to touch this thing. And so these probably were lowly Roman guards. And Pilate still had to play along with these religious guys so they wouldn't cause him any more trouble. There had already been enough. Remember, tensions were high then. There was a war a few years later, a super uprising. So, I mean, they were trying to keep people in control here. And Romans would typically post 4 men. And these religious leaders didn't want anybody to steal the body and say, "He is risen." You know, they just put him in the next tomb. You know, they still don't want it. They still don't want you to know that he's risen. See, nothing is written about what happened from basically Thursday evening to early Sunday afternoon. And because of you had a weekly Sabbath, Thursday, Wednesday evening to Thursday evening. Then you had, Friday evening to Saturday evening was the weekly Sabbath. You had to, it's like having Christmas in the middle of a week kind of thing. So there was two holidays, you might say, where they weren't allowed to do any work. So that had to be when the Marys bought the spices, probably Friday during the day. But then it became Friday evening, it's Sabbath. They still can't do anything. So now they got to sit there twiddling their thumbs, crying their eyes out because of all this. It's 3 long days. And they really couldn't mourn at the gravesite like they would have liked to. So now it's Saturday, late afternoon. Send in the angels. And Jesus died on Wednesday about 3 p.m., was buried twice before sundown. And this had to be something Jesus had dreamed of since childhood, knowing he was going to get up. He was going to die, but he was going to get back up. What a crazy thought. Matthew 28, we're going to start in verse 2. And behold, there was a great earthquake. For the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat on it. And his countenance, what he looked like, was like lightning, and his raiment, his clothing, was white as snow. And for fear of him, the keepers did shake. Those guards, they shook and became as dead men. I was thinking, what a scene. These Roman guards, probably in full battle gear, were sitting there, bored out of their heads, swapping war stories. And they were only there to make sure that nobody tries to steal this body. They didn't want to be there. They were just soldiers. They had to be there. Imagine having to sit there for 3 days. Now remember, Roman soldiers had to always have on them a certain amount of, they carried with them a certain amount of food all the time too. I mean, so they were always prepared for battle, these guys. So these guys were prepared to sit out for 3 days. And so all of a sudden, the ground begins to shake again. And they see this thing fly down from heaven, this light, and, and it rolls this huge stone, totally disregarding the little seal they'd put on there, shoves it out, and then sits down on it with a little grin. And the guards are speechless. And this angel was wearing clothing as white as snow. There's no way in that day and time you could make anything white. They just didn't have the technology to do white. They could do off-white, but they couldn't do white. Now this thing is as white as snow. God must have a good cleaner up there, right? Good dry cleaner. And his body glowed like lightning. Remember when Moses came down and he glowed? Same kind of thing, I guess. This was a little bit too much for these guys to take, so they passed out. When in doubt, pass out. I mean, you think about, these guys were war-hardened guys. But this is beyond, it's just hard. They haven't seen movies like we have, like our kids have. It's just crazy. See, no man and no spirit was going to stop the resurrection and stop it from being publicized. And nothing in the universe can stop any of us if we learn to walk with power. We're unstoppable. And again, this doesn't take a Bible scholar to figure all this stuff out. It just takes flipping back and forth in the Bible. Go to all the Gospels, put it between your fingers, keep looking back and forth, and just track the whole thing. It's not that hard of a study. And the Sabbath is over at sunset on Saturday now. So 3 days have passed. And Jesus rose from the dead on Saturday afternoon. Just before sunset, which is exactly 72 hours after he was put in the grave. Wednesday afternoon, Thursday afternoon, Friday afternoon to Saturday afternoon, 3. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 3 days, 3 nights. And so now the Jewish day starts at sundown. And the ladies, they head to the grave now sometime after sundown on Saturday, because it's no longer the Sabbath anymore. But before sunup on Sunday, I think it was closer to sunup. They probably slept that night, got up, which it'll say here in just a minute. And the guards had already woken up and skulked off. And so Mark 16, we'll pick it up in Mark 16, verse 1. And when the Sabbath was passed, now it's late Saturday evening, early Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome had brought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. So this is sweet spices. It doesn't say what they were. I'll bet it was not aloes and myrrh, because that was just crazy expensive. But there's other things that are sweet. And this is how they did things. And these ladies didn't know Nicodemus had already buried him properly. So they head to the gravesite to properly care for him. And it was Mary from Magdalene, which is from Magdala, which is just on the west coast of the Sea of Galilee, just south of where Peter and all them are from. It was a big Roman hangout, like a resort, Magdala. That's where she was from. And then Mary, the mother of James. There was 2 Jameses that were apostles. This was James the Less, the one you hear about less. Okay, that's one of the Gospels calls him James the Less. So his mom was there, and then a lady named Salome. Verse 2. And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. So it sort of gives you the timing here. And they said among themselves, these women, these 3 ladies, who shall roll us away the stone from the door of the sepulchre? Now they were walking there, and they wondered who was gonna roll that thing away. And the stone wasn't put back; they just weren't there. It was a few-minute walk to get there, so they didn't know. They knew they were going. They knew they were going to do something. But they didn't know how they were going to move that stone. And they'd seen the effort it took Joseph's men to move that thing 3 days ago. And 3 little southern ladies like themselves. Who's going to move that big old stone? And so the ladies forged ahead anyway. And I think where there's a will, there's a way. Sometimes you just got to go for something. You just go for it, and then wait, and then the doors will open up as you move. They usually don't open until you move anyway. That's sort of what I've seen in life. Mark 16, verse 4. And when they looked, they saw that the stone was rolled away, for it was very great. And entering into the sepulchre, they went right in. They saw a young man sitting on the right side. Now that's weird. He was clothed in a long white garment, and they were affrighted, scared. Now, in most biblical records, angels look like humans with cleaner clothes. And no place in the Bible does it say they have wings, though it does make pretty jewelry and pictures. In verse 6, and he, the angel, said unto them, those three ladies, be not affrighted. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He is risen. He's not here. Behold the place where they laid him. And the angel taps his little walking stick on the little cocoon. Look, it's empty. It's hollow. They bend over, they look into it. It's like, he ain't in there. He didn't even shrink. He's gone. And so they're going, what the? How crazy would that be? How did somebody pull him out of there? Verse 7, but go your way, tell his disciples and Peter that he goeth before you into Galilee. There you shall see him, as he said unto you. He told you a while back to meet him in Galilee. Verse 8, and they went out quickly and fled from the sepulchre. I love that. Fled, I was thinking of the little Fred Flintstone people, where the legs start moving, and then the feet take off, and the rest of the body's just waiting, and pretty soon it catches up. These women split. And they went out, fled from the sepulchre, for they trembled and were amazed. They were shaking. That's just a lot to take in. An angel and then a cocoon of a shell that smelled so nice. And neither said they anything to any man, for they were afraid. They didn't talk to anybody on the way back. And they were going back. They ran like the wind back to the disciples' bed and breakfast, telling Peter. The women ran back to tell Peter and the boys about the empty tomb and the angel telling them that Jesus has risen, that he wasn't there. And the apostles thought that these emotional ladies were just making up a silly story. And one of those women was the apostle James's mom. James didn't even believe his own mother. And John 20, verse 2. Then she runneth and cometh to Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and saith unto them, they have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we know not where they've laid him. And Peter went forth. So did they really believe yet, these women? No. Somebody's taken him. They pulled him out of that thing. I don't know where they put him. And Peter went forth and that other disciple and came to the sepulchre. And so they ran both together. And the other disciple did outrun Peter and came first to the sepulchre. And he, stooping down and looking in, saw the linen clothes lying, yet went he not in. Now, some people think this other guy was Lazarus. Some people say it's John. John never mentions his own name in the gospel that he wrote. So I really don't know. I tend to think it's John, but I don't know. And and then cometh Simon Peter following him, and went into the sepulchre, and seeth the linen clothes lie, saw the same little shell of a thing there that smelled so good, and the napkin that was about his head lying not with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. It was set off to the side. So, pretty wild stuff. Peter and another guy ran to the sepulchre. Peter wasn't as fast. The guy bends over. He looks in. Peter jumps right in like the ladies just did. And he squatted down in there and he looked inside this thing. He saw the grave clothes. He saw the ointment-covered wrappings in a shell just lying there empty that was in the shape of a body. Jesus' new body probably had risen right through those 73 pounds of scented grave wrappings. The one guy, the young man, the other guy, he believed at that point that Jesus rose from the dead. He's basically the first one that it says that who believed. Verse 8 of John 20. Then went in that other disciple which came first to the sepulchre, and he saw and believed. For as yet they knew not the scripture that he must rise from the dead. They just didn't understand it. They didn't get it yet. They heard it, they heard it, they heard it, they heard it. They saw stuff, they saw stuff, they saw stuff. Jesus told them and told them and told them, but they didn't get it. But this guy believed. How many times had Jesus said that he was going to raise from the dead? Multiple times. The other guy believed. Peter still didn't. Peter still didn't get it. And he was like Jesus' right-hand guy. So don't be too hard on yourself if you're not believing for a certain thing. Just keep plugging away. Keep trying. Keep working your mind and your life until you get it. And so they leave. They leave. Peter and this other guy leave. And then Mary Magdalene, who had told them, she finally caught up with them. She finally she shows back up there again for the second time. But she's alone this time. The first resurrection appearance. John 20, verse 10. Then the disciples went away again unto their own home. So they went back. But Mary stood without the sepulchre weeping. So she's standing outside this thing. And as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the sepulchre. So now she got on her knees or whatever. She leaned over. She looked into this thing again. And she's crying like crazy. Probably had been for 3 days. She loved Jesus. Mary Magdalene. Of course, she's not with anybody else. She's probably alone here. This is her second trip. And and this also tells you about the size of the cave where you have to bend over to look in. It wasn't like this huge thing like you might see on TV where somebody can just walk right out of. Verse 12. And seeth 2 angels in white sitting. So what's the difference between this and what they saw last time? There's 2 now. And one at the head and the other at the feet. So one's at the head and one's at the feet. I don't know if it's laid sideways in there or this way. I don't know if it was deep or wide. Deep and wide. I don't know. But it's wild. So there's 2 angels, and it doesn't say they were glowing here. This time it says there are 2 angels, and they were sitting at both ends of these wrappings. Verse 13, and they said unto her, Woman, why weepest thou? And she saith unto them, Because they have taken away my Lord, and I know not where they have laid him. She's talking to what she knows to be angels. And she's saying, Where have they taken him? I don't get it. The angel just had already told him, the first one told her that he's risen. He's not here. Now she's asking them again, where is he? Like I said, don't be too hard on yourself. Just keep moving until you can believe. Keep going until you can get what you want. And when she had thus said, she turned herself back and saw Jesus standing and knew not that it was Jesus. So she's looking in there. There's 2 guys in there. She sees that empty shell of a thing in there that's sort of the shape of a body. She's crying like crazy. Where have you put him? Where is he? And she turns around, and then there's a man standing right on the other side of her. Maybe her eyes had adjusted to the dark. Maybe it was too many tears coming down and she couldn't see clear. Or maybe he looked a little different. Because, the last time she saw him, he was not a pretty sight. He'd been beat like crazy. Sorrow turned to hope here. Verse 16, and Jesus said unto her, Mary! And she turned herself and saith unto him, Rabboni, Master, Teacher! All of us, what would it have been like when she realized who was actually standing there? Talk about drama. Right here is where they would cut to commercial. You're learning about some toothpaste or something, And so her eyes adjusted out of that dark cave, and then all of a sudden, when he said to her her name, and probably the way that he said it to her, you know how you say, you might call somebody a certain name or say it a certain, you know exactly who that is. Only that person calls you that way. Mary, it's me, and so it just something in her clicked. Ah, boy. Mary, who was raised near Galilee, was the first person to see the resurrected Christ. And it says that in Mark 16. And it also says in Mark 16 that she's the girl that he had cast 7 devil spirits out of. So she was a mess. He changed her life totally. She was crazy thankful to Jesus, but she also must have been an amazing support to him. For her to have been the very first human to see him. It also tells you how much Jesus respected the ladies. I mean, he stood up against his own disciples who reproved the ladies for anointing his head and feet just a few days prior. I mean, Jesus was amazing. He was way ahead of his time. And so now the second appearance on Sunday. So Jesus then appeared to a few other women as they too were heading to tell the disciples what Mary saw. And Jesus greeted them saying, all hail. But another translation is, cheers. Imagine him just popping out, just appearing in front of them. Cheers! Hey! I'm sure he was having fun. Just imagine a resurrected body. And the cool thing is we're all going to have that. Man. Cheers, ladies. And it says they all grabbed him. They all wanted to touch him. And at the same time, some of the guards who had seen the angel passed out, not all of them, the Bible says some of them, went to the top religious leaders and to tell them what happened, and they accepted this huge bribe money. And they said, Pilate won't touch you. We'll make sure Pilate doesn't touch you, which also tells you that they were probably what kind of soldiers? Roman. Because Pilate could care less about the temple guard. So they go to the Jews, they go to the Jews, and they didn't go to Pilate. They went to these Judean leaders for protection because they knew these guys got things done. They just saw all these goings-ons, and they got huge money to lie and say that somebody stole the body while they were sleeping. Now, the wild thing is that would have been punishment, death for them, if it had gone Pilate's way. So now the third appearance on Sunday. So Peter now revisits the tomb alone. This is his second visit. And he saw the risen Christ at that time. And you can see that in Luke 24:12 and 1 Corinthians 15, 6 through 8. Luke 24:12 and 1 Corinthians 15, 6 through 8. Now the fourth appearance on Sunday. Jesus then appears to 2 men who were walking to Emmaus. After all the crazy events that had happened, these were disciples. Whether new or old, I don't know. But they were going home. And 15 miles, if it's a leisurely stroll, it's about 4 hours. Just to walk it. And so they're walking along, and then this guy walks up next to them and starts talking. And they didn't recognize him. And they listened to Jesus. Jesus appeared to these 2 men, and he shares from memory every verse in the scrolls that pertain to the Messiah. Now imagine the Christ sharing the word with you for 4 hours. And they were blown away how he put all this together. And they got to these guys' house in Emmaus, and they sit down to eat. Also tells you that what you might be able to do with that new body. It's still going to be a part of fellowship, is food. And so now they're eating with this guy who was just blowing their mind with Scripture. And then this guy, Jesus, the risen Christ, he prays. And he takes a piece of the bread that they had laid out. So they took the time to prepare a meal. Now we're going into the day now. Further into the day on that Sunday. Had to be late afternoon by now. Supper time, maybe. And they prepared that meal. He grabs a piece of that bread and he breaks it. And he blessed it and he prayed. And then they realized who it was. And they said, didn't our hearts burn within us while he talked to us by the way? You know, I mean, they were just burning hot on fire, you know, in a positive way, you know, with the words Jesus was saying. But they didn't even recognize him until he broke that piece of bread and prayed. And then they scurry back 15 miles east back to Jerusalem, probably a little faster this time. But it still would take them another 3.5 hours, 3 hours, if they really moved it. If they were running, then they could do it faster, but that probably wasn't very common to do. You know, put on their little jogging shoes, you know, their New Balance or their Noka 1-1s, you know, and they scurry back 15 miles to tell the apostles. And then the fifth and final appearance on Sunday is Jesus appears to 11 of the 12 apostles. 11 of the 12. So you might think, well, one's gone. Who would you think would be gone?
Judas.
Okay, well, let's see. Right, really, this time it says Thomas was absent. So if Thomas is absent and there's still 11 apostles, who is at this meeting? Judas. Judas saw the resurrected Christ. That's not what they show on TV. But that's what it said. Just do the math. 12 minus 1 equal what? 12 apostles minus 1 Thomas makes 11, which includes Judas. Crazy. And so he appears in that bed and breakfast that they were sitting at because Thomas was out. Who knows what he was doing? Doesn't say. 8 days later, he appears to the 11 again. This time Thomas was present, which means who wasn't there? Judas wasn't there 8 days later. Probably that's when he went out and did the dirty deed, so to speak. You know, offed himself. And so, you know, doubting Thomas was at that meeting 8 days later. And Jesus, that time, he still had holes in his hands and in his side. And he told Thomas, thrust your finger in there. And I bet Thomas did. How weird is that? Here, come on, just put it right here. Just shove your finger in there. Put your finger in the holes. You know, I mean, it's crazy. He wasn't in pain. He's able to shape-shift somewhat here. I think how he still is able to be everything we need him to be. And he's probably touched all our lives more times than we realize. And the way we touch his life is by just walking by the Spirit and living truth and walking in the light. And we do that as long as we can in our life. And then the other appearances within a 40-day span, he appeared to a few disciples in Galilee. That's about 70 miles north, 100 miles north, I think. And I don't know why I wrote 70, but it's about 90 to 100 miles. And some of the disciples still don't believe he's risen, even after they see him in his resurrected body. And I didn't tell you all the verses, and I apologize, but they'll be in the text, and you can check it out online if you'd like. Or I can send you this if you'd want, just the notes, your choice. And so they see him in his resurrected body, and some of them still don't believe. And then he appears to Peter and the boys who decide to go back fishing. Remember John 21, that whole chapter? And he tells them, stop fishing and get back to feeding the sheep, taking care of the people. That's what I trained you this whole stupid year to do. And so they leave the nets again in the hands of whoever, and then they go back to Jerusalem where he told them to wait. And then there's one point, it says in 1 Corinthians 15, that he appeared to 500 people at once. And then later he appears to his half-brother James. His brother finally believes. Now, how hard would it be to believe that your brother is the Christ? He had heard this his whole life, right? He'd seen Jesus was a little bit different, a little smarter, probably better looking. He caught things quicker. He was a great kid. James got it. Pretty wild. Let me see here. Oh, and then after 40 days, they actually see him ascend. Remember in Acts chapter 1 at the end of Luke chapter 24, it talks about that, where they're watching him go. And then the angel says, stop gawking and start walking the word. What are you looking at? He's coming back. Get busy. The angel sort of gets on them. So they get busy doing what they're doing, and they made things happen. And then a few years pass. I don't know, I can't exactly tell how many, but a few years, 3 or 4 years pass, and then he appears to a man that literally rocked the world named Paul on the road to Damascus. And the world was never the same again. Everybody else had just dealt with just the people from Israel. Paul took it to the world. And then, and finally, the risen Christ, and I don't know the timing, he appeared to somewhere along the way and told his vision or his victory of rising from the dead to a group of devil spirits who've been imprisoned and not allowed to function since the flood of Noah. And that's like 2,500 years. Imagine not being able to work for 2,500 years, to function, to do anything. And even they realized, even they believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. And the Bible says that they believe and they tremble in James chapter 2, verse 19. And his rising up made them realize they were going down. They realized that they have an end. We realize we have a future. And so look at all the energy and time it took for Jesus Christ to convince even his most faithful followers that he actually rose from the dead. And that he's never going to die again. Because he rose up, we will also rise up to be with him someday. That's a promise. That's our hope. It's a truth. Jesus is still working tirelessly to help us learn to believe and to live amazingly. He is still helping us to seek and to find our dominion. And those, what I just shared, are really, they're the resurrection realizations that happened during that time. Now it's our joy to help others believe that he is risen. God bless.